Good evening. It's my great pleasure to join all of you at your homes in another night, another episode of DiEM25. Tonight with us is Professor Shoshana Zuboff. She is the Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita at Harvard University School and a former faculty associated at the Berman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Her master work is the book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. Welcome, Shoshana. I guess that that's precisely what we want to discuss tonight, a human future. I have been reading the numbers of the preventable deaths in your country and all this horror unfolding all over the place, and it's frightening. I guess that at the time that you wrote the book and at the end of that book, the future looked a little bit grim. Now it is more confusing, accelerated, and conflicting than ever. I feel, and I don't know if you feel the same, I feel like we are part right now of a global experiment with so many of us depending so heavily in what you described as surveillance capitalism. So I would like to welcome you tonight and ask you to start the conversation with a reflection on your personal experience. How are you seeing all of this unfold from where you are at the moment at home, and from your experience and from your closeness to these topics?
Well, yes, thank you, Renata. Hola, Renata. It's so good to see you again. And thanks to all the folks in Europe and around the world who are joining us tonight. What could be more important than all of us being here together to problem solve our way and inspire ourselves to figure out the future together. That's really what this is all about. So, you know, Renata, I mean, to a certain extent, I see the daily events unfold, and sometimes I feel like I'm reading I'm reading the pages that I spent so many years composing. So there is an obvious way in which it looks like, you know, here we are again, a state of exception. Here we are again, the shock doctrine. Here we are again, and the surveillance capitalists exploiting our fear and the global uncertainty in order to aggressively expand their empire, right? So that looks like the story. But I want to talk about a different version of events tonight, a different kind of story. And I want to start with Orwell, if I may. We called this session, one of our leads for this session was COVID-1984. How brilliant is that? So Orwell is here with us. It's on all of our minds. He's on all of our minds. But I want to start with Orwell in a different way, not with 1984. You know that when he wrote 1984, it wasn't because he expected 1984, that nightmare, to constitute itself. It was because he was willing to literally sacrifice his life. You know, he spent those last couple of years when he was working on 1984 up in the Hebrides in a little cottage that didn't have heat, and he had tuberculosis, and it just got worse and worse, and he had deadlines, and he literally sacrificed his life in order to complete this work. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to send a flare out to the world, out to Britain, out to Europe, out to the world, a warning flare to say, this is what can happen if we stop paying attention, if we are not mobilized. So it was, in a sense, the the negative of the photo of the future that he hoped for. In other essays that Orwell wrote, you know, he was a prolific essayist. That's how he made his living. My favorite essay of all was, it was a thinly veiled book review on a book called The Managerial Revolution, written by a guy named James Burnham. And so this book was originally published in 1940. And this is Orwell at his best, excoriating James Burnham. Nothing but despise, despicable, the despicable author and his despicable conclusions. Why? Because James Burnham, he looked at the Third Reich and he was impressed with the administrative capabilities of the Third Reich. After all, it was administrating murder within its own borders and eventually across Europe. He was so impressed with their managerial capabilities that James Burnham predicted, of course, the Germans are going to win this war because they have superior management capabilities. And then a couple of years later, he came out with another edition. And in that edition, the Allies had started to show their force. And so what do you think Burnham did? He changed his entire interpretation. Now he said the Allies were likely to win. Well, Orwell looked at this and he said, James Burnham is my definition of cowardice. He's a coward. And what makes him a coward is he bows down to whatever forces are prevalent at that moment. And he accedes to those forces. And he draws a straight line from the present to the future, as if it were determined by whoever is the strongest at the moment, or who appears to be the strongest at the moment. That is cowardice. So I submit to you tonight that you are reading essays and op-eds and newspaper coverage every single day that is cowardly. Because what it's doing is looking at the might of the tech companies, the might of the empire of surveillance capitalism, increasingly, opportunistically allied with the, not only with authoritarian governments, but with the underlying authoritarian yearnings of democratically elected governments. And we see writers and observers looking at these mighty powers and bending down and saying, this will be the future. This will be the future after COVID-19. After COVID-19, everything will be different. It will be biosurveillance. It will be complete surveillance. Everyone will have given themselves up to permanent and pervasive tracking and all the rest. I say that is cowardly for the same reason that Orwell said it, because the future is unknowable. But we do know this, there is one overriding factor that determines the future. Do you know what it is? It is every single one of you listening to us right now. And it's all the people who are going to be listening to us later. And it's all of the conversations that you're going to have with your friends and the discussion groups that you're going to start in your communities. And it's the things that you're going to write. And it's the blogs and the posts and the videos you're going to make and the conversations you're going to have in the public as well as in your own local sphere. That, what you do, what we do, whether or not we mobilize, that is what will determine the future. And until we know that story, no one knows the future. It's up to us. That's how I want to start.
Well, an exciting start. I think that that's the purpose of actually creating this space, DiEM25. We want to create a narrative of hope and start drafting the new future that we want to see. But now we face a problem, and in all sincerity, right now we are using Zoom, and we are broadcasting by YouTube, and we are like mobilizing our movement through social networks. And it feels somehow that we are like in this completely incongruent behavior. On the one hand, we know that we are like feeding these systems actively and promoting these systems, and with each click and each interaction, we are making them more powerful and making our resistance weaker. And on the other hand, I mean, we need to kind of use the tools of the enemy in the meantime while we build an alternative future. So it is complicated to know where to start. On the one hand, you have this, and I'm part of this community, and we have been working on it like 15 years or more, obsessed with the details, obsessed with some features of this big monster, like strong encryption, very important. If we lose encryption, we lose everything. Or data ownership, data sovereignty. We need to take back our. But it seems to me that the activism that we do is very focused on the small details, and is not taking like, we are not acting, we are not shooting the arrow that will kill the beast, basically. And your book is somehow, your book is that 1984 for our generation, and is that flag. I hope that we can be agile enough to turn the future into something better. But where to start? Are we lost when we are like fighting for encryption, or fighting to make more privacy? And well, it's contradict. I mean, I love a quote that you used. You used this quote of that asking Silicon Valley to protect our privacy will be like asking a giraffe to shorten the neck. And somehow it feels like that. It feels like that we are like just modifying small things. So to our audience, and mostly activists and people willing to create a new future, what would you say? Where to start?
Okay, great. So let me make a couple of comments about our situation right now, and then I want to talk about what really is the theme of our discussion. Okay. So you mentioned Zoom. Now, just your description of our predicament, to me, to my ears, for my brain, your description is an illustration of the huge leap forward that we have already taken. The last time a state of exception allowed the massive expansion, not only of the surveillance state, but created the space for surveillance capitalism to root and flourish, was 9/11. That was a time when in the United States, in September 2001, on Capitol Hill, there were active discussions about comprehensive privacy legislation. And 24 hours after those planes hit the Twin Towers, the conversation had changed dramatically and completely to one focused on total information awareness. And so these fledgling little internet companies that were already getting, very they were acting improperly, and the folks at the FTC had come to understand that they were never going to be able to self-regulate, because at that time it was about cookies and web bugs and things like that. And so that's where the impetus for comprehensive legislation was coming from. But now the intelligence community is looking at these fledgling little companies. Mind you, in 2001, Google employed a handful of people, and that year it made $86 million. Okay, we're talking about tiny little companies. So, but in any case, the American intelligence community and its colleagues around the world, looked at these fledgling capabilities and said, well, forget about legislation. We're going to draw a wide berth around these companies, and we're going to encourage these capabilities because we're going to need them, because they're going to be able to do things outside the rule of law, outside of constitutional constraints that we, whether in the Five Eyes community, that we are not going to be able to do under the constitutional constraints of our own democracies. All right. When they did that, that was the starting bell for surveillance capitalism. Okay, that's what allowed it to grow as powerful as it has, this this growth of empire in just 2 short decades, the absence of law. That's what allowed it to occur, the absence of law. Now, the absence of law, factor number 1. Factor number 2, our ignorance. All these systems were engineered, and a lot of capability and capital went into this engineering, engineered to keep us ignorant, engineered to bypass our awareness. Okay, now hold that thought for a minute, and let's go back to what Renata just said. She said, we know we are marching through these channels. We know we are making them stronger every time we click into a Zoom video. We know we're making them stronger when we're at home all day online under this global lockdown. The fact that you are saying that, Renata, is immense, because 20 years ago we did not know. 20 years ago we had no clue. I don't know how many people are listening to us right now and how many will eventually listen to us, but I know that there are millions, tens of millions of people in our societies right now who know, who have a very deep sense of what is going on, of the idea that our lives, our private experience is being harvested without our knowledge, let alone our consent, and has been used to fund what now have become trillion-dollar market capitalization companies that use our private experience for the larger purposes of social control in the service of their own monetization. So we are aware in a way that we were never aware before. That in of itself is huge. Now, just before I close out this thought, let's just take Zoom as a tiny example of what I'm talking about. The critique of Zoom, there's been a critique of Zoom for quite a while. Maybe some of you know that, but it's been, sequestered, I would say, in specialist communities, the kind of thing you were talking about, Renata, where we're into the weeds of how these systems work. But what is it that's happened in the last, 3 weeks with Zoom? This understanding that was once proprietary, more or less, within specialist communities, a lot of the listservs that I see and that I'm sure you see, this information about Zoom and its egregious anti-privacy practices, it just flew out of those specialist domains right into the bloodstream of the public conversation. And it did that very, very fast. So much so that, you know, it goes all through the bloodstream, and where does it end up? The most ironical comment on Zoom. It ends up in Google, where Google informs its employees, you are no longer allowed to use Zoom for company business. Also the United States Senate and a lot of other people too. So here we have, in a very short span of time, a public mobilization, public opinion, public awareness, driving this new standard. This is intolerable, people are saying, and we won't use it. Now, granted, we're using it, honestly, I've used it off and on this week, but I've also used other platforms as well that people are using. The point is that we know we are thinking critically, and we believe it to be illegitimate. So that's one way in which we are already practicing exactly the kinds of strengths that are going, in my mind, to shape our future more than, you know, simply the mightiness of the tech companies. So let me complete this with what I wanted to say as my second thought, and that is that, apropos of your comments a moment ago, Renata, that, you know, we're worried about encryption and this technique and that technique, and is that what we should be talking about right now? The big headline right now, friends, is that this is not a story about technology. This is a story about institutions. This is a story about the fact that we have just embarked on the third decade of the 21st century, the digital century. We're walking into the third decade, and guess what? We are still naked. All right, this is like living through the 20th century. Hear me now. This is like living through the 20th century without child labor legislation, without the rights to join trade unions and bargain collectively, without the rights to safe and healthy working conditions, without the rights to fair pay, right? Without the rights to not be discriminated against in the workplace because of race or sex or religion or anything else. If we tried to make our way through the 20th century without those rights, the laws that legitimated those rights and served as the source of authority for those rights, and the democratic institutions that governed those laws, we would simply be a societies of oligarchs and serfs if we had tried to go through the 20th century without those institutional forms. But that's exactly where we are right now. We are trying to march through the 21st century, the digital century, which moves fast, without the laws, the regulatory paradigms, and the forms of institutional democratic governance that make the digital safe for people, that make the digital safe for democracy, that re-establish the possibility of market democracies and the idea that digital technology is not inherently surveillance. Digital technology is what democracy wants it to be. This institutional challenge is our work now.
I will go back to there, but I have two challenges to you. One is a pushback on legislation, because now we are in a very complicated situation with Brussels and Washington, D.C., like the main points where this legislation that will influence surveillance capitalism is made completely captured by lobbyists of these companies. And not only that, but an increased cozy relationship between governments and companies. And then you see on the other side, China doing exactly the same, like it is the ally, it is the response, is the first to respond to the catastrophes. It is the Red Cross with the power of the most powerful newspaper and the outreach that no government has at the moment. But what I'm seeing in the regulatory aspects is something that really worries me even more. And I saw it first with the revelations of Edward Snowden. When Snowden came out, lots of the bad practices that were documented on the revelations and explained by journalists were rapidly legalized and normalized. Like the one that really seized the opportunity of regulatory change were the same intelligence agencies doing all the wrongdoings under the excuse of terrorism. They passed legislation to make it legal and even acceptable by the general public. Now we are in a moment, and of course, with a lot of stress, a lot of fear and anxiety, and a desire to go back to normal from the people, I'm seeing two things. On the one hand, I see a narrative on we need this technology to be deployed massively. It will be opt-in, it will not be mandatory, but if you don't do it, you are like really being greedy because of your personal data and your privacy. You will not enable others to go back to the streets, to go back to the factories and so on. So it is increased regulation, and that in some countries, less democratic countries, might become mandatory. In China, it's already mandatory. In many Western countries, might be. In my country, for example, on the forced use of certain technologies to exercise the rights that we defended so hard in the 20th century, right to work, freedom of movement even. And it is becoming like enshrined into laws and exceptional laws that we know what happens after 9/11. Many of those laws stayed forever. So that's one of the things that really worries me. And the second thing is we are in the third decade of this digital revolution. And if I look at the 20th century, the fight for rights only was we declared some sort of victory and created the institutions like the United Nations and so on, institutions that are, by the way, collapsing right now, after a terrible war, terrible human loss, and a complete abandonment of our human values on a global scale. And we pushed the technology of that time. Oh, sorry. Oops. The technology of that, something's falling. I got to...
We need some drama. That's good.
Well, oh my God, I'm too dramatic maybe for this.
No, you go. You're good.
Yeah, but like I was thinking of the atomic bomb. I was thinking about this sophisticated, systematic elimination of human beings. And I see what's happening now, and with all the science, with all the capabilities, we are letting people die. Like basically, the institutions of the past are failing, and the institutions of today are making this normalizing the life for few at the expense of so many people. So my follow-up question will be like that. Are we really heading a dangerous path? And how can we not repeat history? And how can we really commit to this never again? Because classifying people by their human attributes, by their human characteristics, or you have antibodies, you go on this side, or you don't have, you go on that side, or you are expendable, you don't have money, so your life can be sacrificed. All that automated and all that optimized with technology. So on the one hand, regulation is really regulation our friend now, if it's captured. And on the other hand, are we heading again, are we repeating history? And not forgetting that an economic crash is around the corner, and that will lead to a lot of social unrest and uncertainty.
Okay, so, you know, there's nothing that you say that I would deny. But what we don't know is what our response to this will be. So there is politics inherently is the world of the unknown. Politics is inherently uncertain because it depends upon human action. And human action is not programmed, at least not yet. Not entirely and not yet. So this is mobilization. Let me see if I can go back and start at the beginning of your remarks. In the past year, so January 2019 through January 2020, in the United States, we have had introduced into the US Congress 26 significant pieces of legislation that address privacy, and in various ways, none of them perfect, none of them comprehensive, but all of them a great start, in various ways address surveillance capitalism and its ability to do whatever the heck it wants to do. 26 bills. That's unprecedented. In the last 2 decades, we haven't seen anything like that. We also had earlier this year a dial back, not completely, not to the extent that we all wanted, but the beginning, a dial back of some of those the illegitimate practices that were institutionalized in the Patriot Act. So lawmakers around the world, we know, have begun to be mobilized. Now, it's true, they live in a world of lobbyists. And I spent a fair amount of time over this past year, you know, on Capitol Hill and talking to people and trying to do public education with the elected officials and with their staffs. And they don't want to be living in a world of lobbyists. The ones who are switched on to what we're talking about, there are a lot of people there who want to move. They want to do stuff. They want to be on the right side of history. And what they say is, will you please send people to our doors? We don't, because right now the only people knocking on our doors are the lobbyists. We need to see folks up here en masse knocking on our doors. We need to see businesses, not just the surveillance capitalists. We need to see other kinds of businesses who still give a toss about democracy and about market democracy. We need to see them up here knocking on our doors. We want to go out there, but like, we need you guys for cover. That's how it works. They need us, we need them. And, you know, I've been reading a lot of analysis lately, and just about everyone comes to the same conclusion, that this whole wave of new legislative impetus has been driven by public opinion. We cannot underestimate our power. And this, what public opinion am I talking about? This, you know, a lot of it began with Cambridge Analytica and our friend, the whistleblower, Mr. Wiley, right? And then successive, you know, kinds of revelations and leaks and various things You know, I hope that my book contributed at least a little bit to some of this. But the fact is that our consciousness today, our public consciousness today, and the consciousness of, among our lawmakers is different than it was 2 years ago. Now, the question is this toothpaste out of the tube? Is this a difference that is irreversible? Now, I believe there are signs that yes, it is irreversible, but in the end, Renata, this whether or not this is irreversible, I know I keep coming back to the same thing, but because it's true, it depends on how loud we take our pots and pans and get out there in the streets and make a lot of noise. You know, what we do in our communities, the pressure we put on our elected officials, how we use our local political organizations, how we put pressure on our companies, how we put pressure on other institutions. This is going to be critical in the coming year, first of all, so that we move into the second half of this discussion. Okay, so the second half of the issue that you raised, what you want to say something? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I wanted to say something because, and sorry to stop you here, but when you speak about democracy, I remember something, and I don't want to divert the second part of the discussion because I'm fascinated.
Okay, that's all right. Go ahead.
But I was thinking of my country, you know, and I was thinking the country I lived at the moment. At the moment I'm in Berlin, but I live in Chile, and we were under a lockdown before lockdown was fashionable. Let's say we had a lockdown state of exception because of because of our social mobilization against many policies of the government. And when you talk about mobilizing public opinion, we face in many countries in the world a reality of a monopoly of the media. And we have now an integration, a monopoly of the media, and also a monopoly of the platform, and a tyranny somehow of the algorithm pushing certain discourses to be louder than others. So for the first time in history, we are all somehow, never before so many people were connected to the same platform, but never before it was that easy to silence, to hide, and to completely bury some voices. And the banging the pots will sound very loud if you are in Capitol Hill. But if you are in Myanmar and a genocide is being perpetrated and facilitated by Facebook, and you are loud crying and showing that to the world, you know, only if the New York Times, only if someone back home, the home of these companies raises the alarm, someone will care. So this inequality of tools and means, I think that I disagree a little bit that we need to tailor-make different actions and mobilizations depending on the countries that we are at. Some countries, some citizens have big influence in Silicon Valley. Some citizens, I mean, the struggles are different. So I just wanted to say that, and I let you finish with the second part, and then I would like to start referring to the, we have up to 500 people online, and so many are starting to ask questions. So I would like to also give them their ideas on space.
Fantastic. All right, look, you're absolutely right. These dynamics that we're talking about are unfolding under very different political conditions around the world. You know, and this is a distinction that I draw on heavily in the book. If we're talking about these totalizing data systems and the form of power that they produce, and the asymmetries of knowledge that that enforce that power. It's what I call instrumentarian power, the kind of power that works its will on human behavior through the medium of digital instrumentation. And in there, I draw a distinction between kind of, the totalitarian power that terrified, dominated middle of the 20th century. That was a form of power directly aimed at people's bodies and directly employing the violence of terror and murder in order to maintain control. Instrumentarian power operates differently through the medium of the social media, through the media of the nudging and herding and tuning and coaxing and shaping the behavior of individuals and groups and populations. All right, so we can see in countries that are authoritarian in their political systems, we can see what it means to combine these information systems, these data flows that are often developed under the aegis of surveillance capitalism or just straight up surveillance. We combine those with the aims and operations of authoritarian governments. And that is a kind of societal endgame right there, where there is not only the will to total power, but there are also the means to total power. Now, that's why comparing, comparing the Chinese case and the European case or the US case requires a very different kind of analysis. So my premise in my remarks, because we began off saying, we want to understand what is the hope for our democracies. So my premise in my remarks, let me make my assumption explicit, is that we still have democracies on Earth today. They are flawed. They are under siege as perhaps they have never been since the 1930s. But they're still functioning as democracies. And one illustration of that is that we are all here talking right now. That is democracy. We are all here having this conversation right now. And there are tens of thousands of other people all over the internet having other conversations like this. So, as well as in their homes and in their kitchens and in their living rooms, people are talking about these systems. Contact tracing, really? Am I really going to let my phone do that? I don't think so. I'm hearing that from so many people. So my view, Renata, is we have an opportunity to finally bring our democracies up to the challenge of what it means to live at a time when 100% of information is digitally stored. Right? That story of the rapid digitalization of our social media, that's a story that literally is, it's about 10 years old. It was only in 2007 that we could first see 97% of all information was digitally stored. 2007, it wasn't that long ago. In 2002 was the first year that we had more information in digital than in analog. And then by 2007, rise of Google and so on, everything is over there. So just, I know you want to, let me just put a little smile on that. The idea is that the technology has gone through this huge shift. Our institutions have not. The correct institutional practices have not yet been invented. The systems have not yet been invented. The laws and regulatory paradigms have not yet been invented. This is a huge creative undertaking for democracy that, if we look at the 20th century, began in earnest in the third decade of that century after economic collapse.
I have one of the most important things, and is one of the questions of our audience that I wanted to discuss, is a concept. One of the big shames of our generation is the increase of inequalities. I say in plural because it's not that economic inequality or racial inequality disappeared, but it's a superposition of different inequalities. And you referred to a concept that is very interesting that we love our movement to learn more about, which is epistemic inequality. And I think that it connects well with what you were saying. But also because I wanted to tell you that at DiEM25, one of the things that we are doing is precisely writing those policies and trying to imagine those institutions and translating it into policy papers for any progressive movement in the world to copy. And I think that the point that you make will be a very important point. And as a follow-up question connected to that, there's a lot of talk of universal basic income. And one of the questions also asked by our audience is, do we need the equivalent of universal basic income, but on information, just to like kind of level up the critical thinking and kind of provide equipped citizens, not only with economic means, but with this, will it be a way to fix this epistemic inequality that you are going to explain to us? Yeah.
Okay, you might have to just remind me of that last little bit when I as I work my way through this, so I don't forget any of your questions. But all right, epistemic inequality. That means inequality in what I can know and what can be known about me. So here we are, 2 decades into the rooting and flourishing of surveillance capitalism. We've created these huge information empires in the form of, in the West, in the form of private companies. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, certainly in the lead, Apple, of course, in the lead. But there are others, somewhat smaller, who are all part of this ecosystem. Now, the unexpected twist here is that we went into the digital century saying, hooray, this is going to be our century. This is going to be the new Gutenberg century, the democratization of knowledge, disintermediation. We are going to have a golden age of democracy in the digital century. And in fact, we have created this new capability of surveillance capitalism, which moves in the opposite direction. It moves on a collision course with democracy. And it does so because by virtue of its own economic logic and the iron laws of that economic logic, it must collect everything. And it must collect everything in scale, volume, and it must collect everything in scope, varieties. It's not content just to have what you're doing online. It wants what you're doing in your life, what you're doing in your city, what you're doing in your bedroom, in your kitchen. It wants everything. And now, of course, as an aside, with COVID-19, one of its key aims for a long time has been to get your body in your bloodstream and everything in between, get your DNA, right? So that's been an important aspect of expanding its economies of scope. And that's, of course, one of the key opportunities that it sees now. So surveillance capitalism has created unexpectedly these massive asymmetries of knowledge, of information. Instead of the democratization of information, we have unprecedented asymmetries. They know everything about us. We know very little about them. They can use that knowledge to shape our behavior in ways that are designed to bypass our awareness. And we can have no understanding of what they're doing, right? So here we are thinking that the democratization of knowledge in this century was going to make us a more equal society. Instead, it has made us a more unequal society, a new access of social inequality, a new deep abnormality built into what had been a society that was, you know, struggling but committed to democratic functioning. And inequality on this scale is fundamentally at odds with democracy. So how do you counter this? What is our response to this? Our response is that these asymmetries could only constitute themselves in an environment absent of law. That's why Eric Schmidt, the former CEO and chair of Google and so forth, celebrated in his book on the digital future, the internet is the last ungoverned country. Ungoverned is the critical success factor for this form of asymmetrical knowledge and power, for this new inequality. Therefore, it must be governed. There must be law. And that's why I say our challenge now is not a technological challenge. Our challenge is an institutional challenge. We have to create the institutional forms and the laws that will interrupt and outlaw the economic logic that produced this inequality. Now, when we say epistemic inequality, we're talking about inequalities of epistemic rights. Epistemic rights. Who gets to know? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? These are epistemic rights that follow the arc of knowledge, authority, and power. Epistemic rights follow the trajectory of all other rights that have been codified in law. Let me explain what I mean, and I'll turn it back over to you and our audience. Take freedom of expression as a right, okay? Every baby can open its voice and make noise. It doesn't need a juridical right to voice. Every single one of us, God willing, our, you know, all of our anatomy and physiology is working in a healthy way. Every single one of us can speak. Every single one of us can express ourselves, and that has always been the case. We didn't need a right. We didn't need a law to make it so. There was a moment in history when our political lives in our societies became complex enough, dense enough, intense enough that our right to voice was challenged, was threatened. And it was in that point in the development of humanity, in the development of society, and especially in the development of the idea of democracy, that we understood we now need to make expression, which is an elemental right. We need to change that from being an elemental right into being a juridical right, something that is nailed down in law under the power of democratic governance, right? Under the umbrella of democratic power. The law is the authority, and it remains so because it is protected by democratic power. That is the life cycle of new rights. And we are at that moment now, Renata and everybody, we are at that moment now in history when our rights to know were also elemental. I'm the only one who gets to know about my experience. I'm the only one who gets to know about what I do in my kitchen or my bedroom or my back garden. I'm the only one who gets to know what I'm feeling by, even though I disclose it through my facial muscles, I'm the only one who gets to know what I'm feeling. These are elemental rights that belong to me. The power to know about, my right to know about my own private experience. We have now entered, because of epistemic inequality, the rise of surveillance capitalism, these asymmetries, we have now entered that point in history where my right to know my own experience can no longer be taken for granted and must be translated into law. And those laws will interrupt and outlaw the very systems of power that we're discussing.
And so, thank you for that. And something that you were saying connects well with, there's a lot of worry from the audience on, are we heading to a system like the Chinese social credit system, especially in this, because law operates, and the rule of law operates well in normal times, let's say, but in exceptional times, we heard like lots of crazy stories of drones flying in parks, shouting at people, of a police entering the house of people because the telephone was out of battery and they wanted to enforce these quarantines. And we have seen, I mean, I have seen it before in the US, which in my view is increasingly authoritarian and increasingly using technology together with police brutality to enforce some behavior in some vulnerable populations, concretely, for example, with undocumented workers in the US, and how Palantir and the ICE are like having these alliances. So I wanted to hear your comment on that. And one of the comments that the audience said is, will we look back at this time and at these tech companies the same way that we looked at slave owners in the past? And because is that, will we be horrified about our behavior and about the way that we were treated, or that we treated some parts of the population, the way that we let that happen because of tech solutionism? So those are some of the comments. And because we have very little time, what really got our audience hopeful was your call to mobilize bottom up. So if you could close your remarks with a positive note on how we could, like right now, use this very terrible situation we are all into as an opportunity to push global change through our movements.
Okay. Well, look, everything that you described in the first part of your remarks there, the drones and the police who enter, and power fills a vacuum. What we are experiencing right now, remember I said a little while ago that we've entered the third decade naked? That nakedness is another metaphor for this vacuum. We've entered the third decade with all the technological capabilities, the asymmetries of knowledge and power that they've given to a very what has become now a kind of tight-knit group of companies and their alliances with the state. The nature of those alliances vary from country to country, but we see now in the time of crisis, a little bit of the veil lifting on the alliances between these companies and the state, and the degree to which the state has become dependent on these companies for the knowledge that it needs, which, by the way, is the fulfillment of the original plan. Let these fledgling companies develop their surveillance capabilities because we'll need them. And now you see exactly, how that's been working all along, but now we see it in a very dramatic way. So the point is, we are now reaping the whirlwind of the fact that we've made it through the first two decades of this digital transformation without law and without the kinds of institutional forms that we need to keep us safe and to keep us democratic and to keep things fair and to keep a balance of power and to sustain democracy and to sustain individual sovereignty and dignity and rights and to sustain what we think of, however imperfectly, as equality. And it is power that has constituted itself faster than our institutional response that fills this vacuum. So they can walk into your door and they can send a drone over the park and there is nothing on the books to stop them. This is exactly my point. Now, we all feel the pressure of this crisis, but we have to know that creating the institutional forms that we need, creating the new law that we need, creating the new regulatory paradigms that we need, folks, this does not happen in a week or a month or a year or a legislative cycle. This is the work of this decade. I'm sorry if that sounds depressing, but this is how it goes. We entered the 1930s without, certainly in the United States, we entered the 1930s. There was nothing like Social Security. There was no kind of health available from the state, no kind of healthcare available from the state. There was no way to stop 8-year-olds from being employed in factories. There was nothing that protected people who tried to form into collectives and bargain collectively and use their right to strike. I mean, it took most of the 1930s in my country to create the institutional forms that now we can't imagine living without. That's where we are in this. All right. So how do we do that? How do we mobilize? Look, many of you are already parts of organizations. And I want to go back to a comment that you made about Myanmar, okay? Because there are, many of our brothers and sisters live in countries that where they are facing much less opportunity than we have to organize, to be loud, to be active, to mobilize, and to make a difference. So we have to make a difference for them, because the bigger difference that we make, the easier it's going to become for them, the more pressure is going to be on their governments. Because increasingly in the future of this decade, we're going to see there's the Chinese future, and we need to establish a democratic future, a democratic digital future that is in contrast to the Chinese future. And then the people of the world are going to look at these contrasting futures, and one is going to be more appealing than the other, let's just say. because human beings seek the light. And so the democratic alternative is going to be far more powerful. And that is going to instill not, inspiration and motivation and pressure on those societies. I mean, I'm talking about decades, but that's how these dialectics work over time. So right now it's up to us to reject the determinism and the inevitablism that we're reading every day in the papers and the op-eds, and we're hearing every day from the gaslighting of the tech companies. When they say, don't worry, this is only going to be for now and that it'll go away for later and it's all opt-in and so forth. We know better than to accept their gaslighting. So we need to reject what they're saying. We don't do what James Burnham did. We don't bow in a cowardly way to the forces of the moment and say, that's inevitably the future. We reject it. And in rejecting it, we have to double down on this conversation. We have to do it with conviction. What is intolerable? What are the kinds of laws that will stop this? Just in the past couple of days, Macron, and I understand that there are many different feelings about Macron and his leadership, but let's just say this. There was a new awareness in his most recent remarks that we are facing a world without the institutional tools that we need to be successful. And using the word over and over again, humility, right? I read that with some compassion of a leader who is at a point where I understand that we don't have this figured out and we need to figure it out. And so there are a whole lot of lawmakers out there, some of whom we have supported in the past, some of whom we have not. But they are all hitting a wall and they need us to show them the way through and that we will accept nothing less. Please.
Yes, just to close, because we went a little bit over time, and in spite of lockdown, it's Saturday night, and I know that everybody have plans. I am happy that you left us with this very precious book and very long book detailing all the problems. I'm also hopeful I will read your next article, because I know that your next article that you are going to write, it will be a call to arms, a call for action, because that's the one pager of that book is what we need right now to activate and mobilize globally. And we will make of this a global struggle. We will make it with all the progressive forces all over the world. And I think that we shouldn't speak about Chinese future and democratic future. I want to imagine of a future, including a democratic China, actually, and where everybody is included. And I think that that's why DiEM25 was founded, and that's why the Progressive International will be launched shortly, because we are in this together, and for the first time we have a common ground, a common departing point. Many of the struggles of the 20th century are still struggles in many countries in the world: child labor, women's rights, so many things. Of course. But that shouldn't impede us from working together towards a common, better future for all of us. So I want to thank you for the time. Thank you for this flag that you elevated, and for the challenge. As my good friend and one of my mentors, Julian Assange, said, courage is contagious. And I think that courage that you described is what we need right now, and action and strategy, and brilliant minds like you help us to create a more coherent narrative and to transform this long marathon into a victory for human rights without repeating the mistakes of the past. Thank you so much, Shoshana.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you.
Gracias.
Gracias a vos.
Bye.
And thanks to all our friends who joined us today. Thank you.